Hey everyone, and welcome to my video presentation for course OL 680, Global Moral Responsibility at Brunel University. My name is Ryan Timm, and the country that I chose for this assignment is Germany. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of moral principles and ethical dilemmas, we must first understand why I chose Germany for such a project. I was fortunate enough to live in Europe for 6 years of my active military career, 2 of which in Germany, and I fell in love. I directly supervised 10 local national civilians, and the entire experience opened my eyes to the differences in culture and business conduct, which provided continual motivation to learn as much as I could. The economic value of Germany is strong as well, being the 5th ranked power index globally. I was intrigued by the continual success and was quite anxious to identify possible areas of improvement for them. Germany is centrally located in Western Europe, with a population of 82.79 million people. It utilizes a modern-style economy that promotes a 6th-ranked GDP rating, that is, the overall international rating for gross domestic products within a given year. Some important facts about Germany relates to intellectual property and corporate corruption laws. Intellectual property is a wide-scope topic that covers both personal and professional use and is involved in everything from posts on social media and third-party video creators, all the way to licensing agreements and website regulation. In an age where technology reigns king, issues naturally arise in the corporate setting, and Germany is no different. Not being cognizant of intellectual property can and will get a potential leader on the international platform into hot water. Corporate corruption is generally low in Germany, although is consistently high in specific industries. Land administration, customs administration, and public procurement are a few areas of government that are routinely highlighted as a moderate to severe risk in corruption and may pose difficulty when conducting international business. Additionally, anti-corruption legislation largely falls under the German Criminal Code, which holds individuals accountable, not corporations. And this may contribute to the lax approach to corruption in these specific areas of industry. Two moral issues that I chose to conduct my research on would be intellectual property in the corporate setting, more specifically regarding licensing agreements, and bribery and favoritism with government officials on the international stage. Throughout this presentation, I will explain actual situations surrounding these issues and analyzing how a United States organization was affected by such actions of various German companies. I'll be utilizing the Ross-Garrett 9-step method for moral decision-making to interpret what transpired, which moral principles were involved and conflicting, and offer an opinion as to what the correct action to take for each given situation. The first example is of Siemens AG, a German-based industrial manufacturing company that conducts business in 190 countries, employs 385,000 people across 265 international factories, with an overall annual revenue of $87 billion. Siemens was investigated in 2006 for using bribery and favoritism to gain market shares and increase their prices. The investigation involved at least 19 countries around the globe, in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The organization was convicted of charges related to bribing government officials and civil servants, as well as granting favors in exchange for leniency with local regulations. The case resulted in the largest monetary sanction ever imposed under America's Foreign Corruption Practice Act of 1977, ultimately resulting in Siemens being ordered to pay $1.6 billion in fines and penalties, which includes $800 million of that directly to the United States. Step 3 of the Ross-Garrett moral decision-making method requires the identification of relevant stakeholders in the organization. For Siemens, that would be the stockholders and board of directors whose primary concern is revenue, managers and employees involved in all 265 locations, the communities and competitors around the world, and their many customers. Step 4 of the method then requires us to highlight the interests of each stakeholder. Again, the board members and stockholders' primary concerns is making money. They tend to be happy if business and revenue is steadily improving. Managers and employees of all levels are concerned with retaining their employment and producing superior products. Communities and competitors are primarily focused on sustaining factories in high employment areas and promoting healthy competition. And the customers want affordable prices for sufficient and adequate products. Step 5 revolves around brainstorming possible actions that an organization could take. And in the case of Simons, there are really only four: conduct business with bribery or favoritism, or don't. The company can choose to conduct business in accordance with the Foreign Corruption Practice Act of 1977, abiding by the stringent bribery and favoritism guidelines of international business, or they can choose to willfully disobey the regulation. Step 6 of the decision-making method then requires a thorough analysis, weighing the pros and cons for each option given in the previous step. For video purposes, I set a line separating the difference between conducting and not conducting business in accordance with the regulation. The pros for using bribery or favoritism is billions of dollars in revenue, monopolizing developing countries, and inheriting strategic advantages that accompany a well-placed factory in a country that could sustain one. The cons for participating in such practices, however, could result in sanctions and fines, the likes of which pose unrecoverable conditions for most companies. Along with that, factories could close, employment being terminated, and a decrease in revenue due to price increases, all to offset such sanctions. The pros for acting in accordance with established regulation would be not receiving such fines or sanctions, and the trust of consistent business partners, knowing that there is no ulterior motives to your antics. The cons are a resulting increase in competition due to availability and a loss in geographic advantages by way of said competitors undercutting your offers. We then move on to step 7, which requires the analysis to focus on conflicting principles. These are prima facie principles that alone may sway a decision to act one way or another, but pose conflict with each other, resulting in an ethical dilemma. The first of the two sets of conflicting principles identified in the Simon scandal would be beneficence versus honesty or justice. Beneficence tells us to act to make people's lives better. People, in this case, being stockholders and board members. They are seeking to make their own lives better by increasing revenue. This principle conflicts with honesty, which wills us to speak and act honestly, representing ourselves in a manner that is consistent with the image we portray. Simons had a stellar reputation for operating ethically until the investigation broke, effectively tarnishing their reputation in the industry. Beneficence also conflicts with justice, which is treatment of everyone fairly in the community. The actions of the primary decision makers at Simons were not following the condition that everyone follow the rules and regulations outlined by international government. The second set of conflicting principles involved in the Simons corruption scandal was universalizability versus utility maximization. Universalizability tells us to act in accordance with how we believe everybody should be treated. We see this principle, or at least the absence of the principle, by Simons neglecting the regulations and standards all business conducts should be held to. The US and other countries impose such sanctions to return them to the universal obligations that most nations are bound to, whereas utility maximization relates to the promotion of benefits, of which Simons AG took full advantage of. They identified a way to conduct business outside the provided guidelines and was largely successful until caught. Which leads us to step 8, the applicable principles for the Simons situations. I highlighted two: universalizability and justice. As I stated just a few moments ago, it is integral to international business that everyone operate in conjunction to the rules that govern all, which evens the playing field. But in addition to that, universalizability urges us to act in accordance with how we believe all should act. Simons was, in fact, not acting how the majority of the globe conducts their business, and I believe provides the needed focus to offer preferable actions. The final step of the Ross-Garrett moral decision-making method is to use information provided from the previous steps to identify a preferable action for the situation. As this step relates to Simons AG, I would have simply conducted business in accordance with the Foreign Corruption Practice Act of 1977, which outlines what is described as corruption in business. Both bribery and favoritism are outlined in the regulation and provides insight into potential punishments, which Simons learned firsthand. Along with the abiding of the laws, I also feel that competition can be a good thing for business and that no one company should have a monopoly on a certain industry. Playing fairly promotes the applicable principles of justice and universalizability on the international platform, which enriches the global marketplace. The second moral issue that the United States-based organization faced in Germany was intellectual property by way of copyright infringement in the government, more specifically the United States Navy and their use of 3D software. Bit Management Software is a German-based company that creates 3D software for training aids around the world, software that the US Navy was interested in. The Navy, however, used a third-party vendor to acquire the software. There is nothing inherently wrong with doing so, but that said, Bit Management was under the impression that the US Navy was only testing their products on 38 computers, when the reality was that they installed the software on almost 600,000 devices. Bit Management, in turn, opened a lawsuit with the US Federal Claims Court asking for $600 million in unpaid licensing fees. Intellectual property comes into play because, although Bit Management was the creator, they forfeited their right to the property when accepting third-party representation, of which the Navy was properly fulfilling their contractual obligations. The relevant stakeholders for this situation was the stockholders and board members of Bit Management, the legal representation of each party involved, and the US government, more specifically the Department of the Navy. The interests of the stakeholders may seem obvious, but still applicable and justified for this scenario. Both the United States government and Bit Management want to properly defend their side, which in turn would result in a huge payout for the German company, or not compensation being made at the DoD's expense. The lawyers defending all parties involved stand to receive a large compensation for a victory as well, so their pursuit to win such a case is increased. But in addition to the monetary value involved, Bit Management wanted to hold the US Navy accountable for the defamation of which they believed to be a valid contract. There are 4 options identified as possible actions the US Navy could have taken. The first is conducting business directly with Bit Management, not using the third-party vendor. A pro for this action would be allowing for a thorough contract that outlines the do's and don'ts of each party and eliminating any ambiguity in the situation. It would, however, prove costly as using a middleman is often much cheaper than the originating organization. Action number 2 would be to conduct business using a third-party vendor, much like the Navy did. This will typically be a cheaper option, but provide that gray area that was highlighted in the scenario described. Potential action number 3 is to seek other means of acquiring the 3D software, whether that be other vendors or companies that make similar products. A pro for such an action could be that you find a better product for cheaper prices, but you run the risk of purchasing products that are inadequate for training needs, such as those required of the Navy. And the last possible action would be simply to choose not to pursue 3D software. This will obviously save money for other ventures, but the major con here is that you guarantee failures in training. With an ever-growing technological field, it is integral to the success of the military to keep up with the times, and not engage in such ventures would almost certainly hinder progress, not help it. Once again arriving at step 7 of the moral decision-making method, we must identify conflicting principles. The first 2 sets of principles, I recognize honesty versus non-injury. To review, honesty is acting or speaking honestly and representing ourselves as such. This conflicts with non-injury, which urges us not to do anything that harms others. The Navy believed that they were acting honestly when they followed the contract given by the third-party vendor, whereas Bit Management filed a lawsuit for reparations that they felt were justified and owed because of their actions. Bit management felt as though they were acting in a way that is protecting their organization from harm as it relates to lost revenue and unaccounted for software. The second set of conflicting moral principles would be utility maximization versus respect for rights. Utility maximization is all about the promotion of benefits or harm. In this case, it would be benefits. The US Navy took it upon themselves to install such software on almost 600,000 devices, exploiting their assumed freedom and effectively promoting their benefits. Where Bit Management viewed the situation as the Navy not respecting their rights as a company by way of compensating them for their software. Step 8 then leads us to applicable principles as they relate to this scenario, of which I have identified two: justice and respect for rights. Justice is treating everyone fairly, and respect for rights is all about not violating the rights of others, both of which the Navy exploited due to ambiguity in the third-party contract. They saw an opportunity to take advantage of their freedoms and successfully installed the software on hundreds of thousands more devices than they realistically should have before Bit Management was aware. Their actions did not follow the applicable principles of justice or respect for rights. The preferable action identified in step 9 is to conduct business directly with Bit Management software. It might be more expensive, yes, but it does away with the vague nature of a third-party vendor. Ultimately, it is this ambiguity that saved the US government from paying almost $600 million in unpaid licensing fees. But still, it could have all been avoided had they worked directly with the creators. Lastly, I feel that any international organization, but definitely the Department of Defense, should promote fair business practices that respect the rights of all involved. If this is accomplished, I believe that you can create a positive culture that can promote sustained growth. To conclude, I would just like to say thank you for viewing my presentation on possible moral issues and ethical dilemmas that one may face when conducting business in Germany. Before you is a comprehensive list of references that I used when conducting my research. Both situations, the Siemens AG or the Bit Management software, were quite fascinating to analyze. I highly suggest you look them up if you have some free time. I will end on one final positive note about Germany. Having lived there and conducted business for the military firsthand, it was an enjoyable tour and, for the most part, an ethically sound country for a potential leader to promote international relations. Thanks again for viewing, and I wish you all the luck in all your presentations.